morning. Thanks for joining us, and I have the great pleasure of introducing this first conversation of the Sustainability Forum. And it's going to be quite a difficult conversation after such a compelling video, and I'm sure you're all still shaking, reflecting on what you have just watched in that video. So the session this morning, a critical session: fire, floods, biodiversity loss, pandemics. What else do we need to react? And what a timing it is for that. Just as we speak, COP15, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, is taking place. Only in 2 weeks' time, COP26 kicks off in Glasgow, the UN Convention on Climate Change, and how much we need to reflect on what we have just seen on that video and what's coming ahead of us. And exactly what does that mean for business? Because I think that's what the question that we're all asking. My name is Thomas Erkovic, and I have an incredible panel of speakers ahead of me, and I will be introducing them in a few moments, and I cannot tell you how excited I am about this next hour or so. So let's start, and before we get into the debate, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who will deliver an initial keynote address. And it's a privilege to introduce Marco Lambertini. Marco is the Executive Director of the World Wildlife Fund International, an incredible organization that has been pioneering nature conservation for more than 60 years. And some of the most compelling global initiatives in the world, including Earth Hour, are part of the work of Marco and his team. So we will start with a very short video, and then we'll go straight into Marco's initial keynote, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thomas, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to MS for inviting WWF and myself to this event. Really exciting.
So we'll be hearing from you for the next few minutes for the opening remarks.
Very happy to do so, and I think there should be a slide deck with the organizers in the studio, so if they can kindly put the slide on and advance it, that would be very helpful. Thomas and everyone, we're living really extraordinary times never experienced by our civilization, something that science are calling the planetary emergency. And this is not anymore green alarmism. This is actually science speaking. And science is talking about us as a civilization reaching potentially environmental tipping point. But as you can see from the title of my presentation, we are at a point where it's our choice to either drive natural systems of the planet towards a tipping point, a point that will destabilize the ecosystem that have been supporting our development as a species and support many other species on the planet for millions of years, or actually take this opportunity to reflect on our impact on the planet and turn the tide from a crisis into an opportunity for future generations. Next slide, please. The exciting thing is also that today we know exactly what's happening, what is our impact on the planet, and the consequences that it is having on the natural systems. First of all, next slide, please. First of all, population growth. We took hundreds of thousands of years to reach the first billion people on the planet. We took 100 years to add the second billion. And then from 1960, effectively with a great technological development of our society, we have been adding effectively 1 billion new people every decade. That's combined with the consumption that, of course, has grown at the same time, has created a massive impact on the natural world. This is what the scientists are calling the great acceleration, and it is quite extraordinary. If you look at the consumption of almost everything, from energy to water to timber, fish, food of any sort, the curve is exactly the same. After 1960, the acceleration has been exponential in all this utilization of natural resources. Clearly, this is not sustainable. Clearly, this is not something that the planet can tolerate and withstand. Next slide, please. So, welcome to a new age. The scientists are beginning to call the age we're living in as the age of the Anthropocene, the age of humans. We had Jurassic, the age of dinosaurs, famous for all the movies that we made on. And this is the age of humans. And let's hope we're not ending up like the dinosaur did. And the good news in this case is that really this is depend on us. But surely the situation is very dramatic. Next slide, please. The introduction that was made at the opening of this event already made some very clear points about the crisis that we're facing in terms of global warming. We are already 1.2 degrees of global warming from pre-industrial times, and we know that 1.5 is entering in true danger zone. 1 million species are on brink of extinction. 90% of fishes stock in the ocean are either fully fished or overfished. Next slide, please. And we're beginning to see things we've never seen before. For example, the die-off, large-scale die-off of corals in warm waters on the tropics, and they die because of the water getting too hot. So we're beginning to see heat waves in the sea as well as we are seeing on the atmosphere. New phenomenon that are all alarm bells for us to react. Next slide, please. So effectively, you can argue that humanity has never been in a better place. If you look at the average income, if you look at poverty level, if you look at childbirth mortality, if you look at life expectancy, all these indicators of social well-being and human well-being have been going up, have been going in the right direction. But unfortunately, that has happened at the, can you click please for the animation? That has happened at the expenses of the environment. And so we're now beginning to understand that actually this development model, the economic development model we have embarked in, particularly in the last 100 years, if not several decades, is just not sustainable. We are eroding the natural capital that it is fundamental to maintain our development. And we are increasingly aware, not just of the impact that we're having, but also the consequences that this impact is having on us, not just on the natural world. And so the nature conservation is not anymore only an ecological issue. It's actually an economic issue, a social issue, and it's beginning to be also an health issue for public crisis. Next, please. And so we understand, for example, that the economic impact on nature loss can be disastrous. Recent economic studies have highlighted that, for example, our global economy is depending largely on the health of natural systems. Think about agriculture, fishing, think about tourism, and think about the supply that nature provides to industrial production, starting from water access. So half of the global GDP, $44 trillion, are actually dependent on healthy, natural functioning systems. And connected to that, 1/3 of the workforce today, and equivalent to 1.2 billion jobs, are also depending on healthy environments. So, not to mention, of course, the health dimension. COVID pandemic has taught us a very tragic lesson by highlighting how, by deforesting and exposing ourselves to viruses in nature, by consuming and trading wildlife around the world, we are exposing ourselves to diseases that are the type of COVID-19. And 70% today of all emerging human diseases are actually of zoonotic nature, meaning they are originating or transmitted from animals to humans. Next slide, please. But it's not just about risks. It's also about opportunities. And equally, economic studies are highlighting how, by embracing sustainable transition in sectors like food, like land, agriculture, and fishing, the ocean, infrastructure, energy, we can not only embrace a sustainable way of producing goods and economy, but it's also a way to generate a new type of economy with added economic value, 10 trillion by 2030, and added opportunities for jobs, 400 million by 2030. Simply because, for example, renewable energy or organic agriculture are more labor intensive than the traditional way of using energy, fossil fuel based and chemical based agriculture. And so there is an opportunity to develop by embracing the sustainable path. Climate change and nature law. These are the two sides of the same ecological challenge. And too often they are considered separate, and too often we focus on climate and not enough on biodiversity. The two are connected. Think about the impact of climate, forest fires that destroy biodiversity. Think about deforestation for food production that is exacerbating climate change because of the emission it generates. So next slide. So our civilization is a turning point. We need to adopt a plan, a clear direction, and a plan to bend these two curves. Bend downwards the curve of emissions and bend upward the curve of biodiversity loss. Next slide. And so 4 key things to do as part of this plan. First of all, we need to protect and restore more of what natural habitats are left on the planet. We need to at least protect 30% of on land and in the ocean, and restore 20% of what we have lost. We need to sustainably manage the rest, to sustainably manage the forests, fish stocks in the ocean, the rivers, and in particular, next slide, we need to focus transitioning in a sustainable way 2 major systems. The energy system, of course, towards renewable energy, and the food system towards producing food or capturing living resources like fish in the ocean and the rivers, all that are supporting a regenerative production model, a model that is able to take the interest of the capital, natural capital of these resources without eroding the resources themselves. And so a sustainable way of producing food. All this is possible. It's possible technologically, and particularly it's possible because we also are in a position to begin to repurpose, to redirect the investment, public subsidies and private investment, to allow for this sustainable, or as we say, nature positive, carbon neutral transition. That's critical. At the end of the day, it is about system. At the end of the day, nature and people agenda are part of the same agenda. It's not about conserving nature in isolation from developing our society. It's about integrating the two. It's about putting nature at the heart of our society, our economy, as the foundation of our development in the safe future. Next slide. And that's what I would like to close this short introduction, Thomas and everyone, by calling for the world, and the governments of the world are meeting today, as we speak, in Kunming, China, to discuss exactly a plan to deal with the biodiversity crisis. We have a plan. We may argue we are not fast enough according to that plan, but in Paris, we agreed a clear global goal for climate, carbon neutrality, and a clear plan to decarbonize society by 2050. We don't have a clear plan for nature. We need one. And so we are asking to raise a global goal for nature, nature positive by 2030, that in parallel with carbon neutrality will become our twin, our double compass towards a sustainable future, a safer future for all of us, a more equitable future for all of us. In fact, I have to say, the only future humanity can have. I'll stop here and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Marco, thank you very much. And I really like that idea of the double compass between climate and nature, because that's what we are going to talk about over the next hour or so, and it's a critical dimension. And let me just go through what we're going to be discussing this morning. Firstly, what is the scale of the challenge? And I know that we have heard a lot of numbers and a lot of targets and dates that we need to meet. I know we've also heard a lot about expressions such as radical, unprecedented, planetary emergency, code red, so I don't know what other type of language we need to get this deep into the strategy of every single business in the world. And also we're going to talk about how not only the business community, but also civil society, governments, the media, and youth and society at large are reacting, facing with these twin challenges that Marco was talking about. And finally, what are the solutions? And what is the action that we need to take? So in order to do that, Marco will be joined by two other exceptional speakers. So allow me to introduce them. Alongside Marco, we will be having Anne Larigauderie. Anne is the Executive Secretary, as mentioned before, of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Anne has been working most of her career on the intersection between science and policy and is an expert on all nature-related matters. And joining Anne and Marco is Hans Otto Portner. So Hans is not new to this forum, and we had the pleasure of meeting him at the last edition that we had in 2019, or the last time that I was here. And Hans, as people might know, is a co-chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group number 2 on vulnerability of socioeconomic and natural systems to climate change, and he is an expert on all matters related to climate. So I can see all my three panelists here now on the screen, so it looks like everything is working perfectly well technology-wise, which is fantastic. Thanks, Anne, for the nod. That's giving me a lot of comfort. And let's go straight into this. And Hans, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. And we've heard all those big words coming from the IPCC reports. What are the visible signs that the change is already happening? How can you summarize to us the change that we have already done?
Yeah, thanks a lot, and hello everybody. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to be part of this discussion. And certainly the impacts of climate change are most visible, and now they're really most visible on all continents and in all oceans, not just through the trend, the warming trend that we've heard about in the short presentation, but mostly through the impact of extreme events. Their likelihood has increased, and the severity, the intensity of these extreme events has increased. And you've mentioned some of those yourselves. This concerns heat waves, the temperatures experienced by organisms, including humans, are rising. We are seeing flood events in places where we haven't seen them before. We are seeing storms with an intensity and high intensity storms at a frequency not experienced before. And we are seeing the associated damages. We are seeing direct impacts on humans, on human lives. We have been losing thousands of human lives during past heat waves, which indicates that we have a huge adaptation gap that is also to be considered in addition to making every effort to mitigate climate change and reduce its degree. But we can certainly go into more detail later on.
Super. Thanks, Hans. And obviously one of the striking images in the opening video by Natasha was that of refugees and climate refugees, and there's all that people dimension that we tend to forget when we just think about this challenge. So Anne, can I bring you now and ask you about this dual compass or compass of the interconnection between nature, biodiversity loss and climate change? How would you summarize the linkages between both?
Good morning, Thomas and everyone. First of all, I would say that climate change is one of the major causes of biodiversity loss. So species of plants and of animals have evolved in very specific climatic conditions. They are adapted to these conditions. And if those conditions change, as is the case now with climate change, then species are going to have to adapt, which is often quite difficult for them, or they are going to be to try to migrate, which also presents many challenges. But there are many documented examples of such migrations currently. Life is on the move. So we're starting to see species move towards the pole. So in the northern hemispheres, that would be moving towards the north, and in the southern hemisphere towards the south. But plants and animals are also trying to move up in altitude. So, for example, you have tree species in Europe that are moving north, but also in the oceans, we have range shifts which move about 6 kilometers per year or so. That's a big average. There are pests that are moving and in new territories. I believe that here in Luxembourg, you also have the stinging pine processionary caterpillars. They are very slow, but they are making their way north in new territories, causing all kinds of health and allergic issues. In France, I know that they've been moving about 250 kilometers in 40 years. So that is just an example, but if species cannot move, and that is the case for many of them, for example, if seeds cannot be carried by the wind, or if animals, because of the fragmentation of habitats or the destructions of habitat, cannot go and into new territories, then they can go local extinct at the local level, or sometimes also at the global level. But Hans mentioned many of the other types of impact that climate can have, and that can also impact biodiversity as well, not just through temperature, and for example, through the intensity of fires and the frequency of fires. But we can come back to that perhaps later.
Absolutely. Thanks, Anne. So in hyper-connected, the word is not going to come to me, climate and nature, and we're already seeing the consequences. Hans, in his opening remarks, Marco was talking about the Anthropocene, and we've been debating, I think, for way too long if it's climate induced, if climate change is induced by human activity or not. So are we clear on the causes of what's making the dramatic changes we're seeing on both climate and in nature?
I think we can put the debate on what is causing climate change to rest. I mean, there's a very simple sentence to be said here. Climate change for the last 150 years has been caused by human activity, full stop. There is no natural cause that is explaining or contributing to the patterns of change that we are seeing. I think this answer is very clear, and certainly human activities are influencing the pattern of climate change that comes from the emission of greenhouse gases, like the changes to the biosphere that Anne has mentioned. the changes of landscapes, removal of forests, and the sealing of surface areas is contributing to the patterns of climate we are seeing. We have removed in our history about 50% of the plant biomass, and thereby also removed the capacity of forests, for example, to bind CO2, a capacity that we are now increasingly discussing to what extent it can help us to mitigate climate change. So we have really moved ourselves into a dilemma, and we need to turn around at various fronts in order to move us out of this crisis.
Of course, and clearly it is a very complex dilemma, and I'm sure we'll be getting into that in a few minutes. Just maybe to close this first round, Marco, from your global perspective of looking at the work of your organization, what sort of impacts are you seeing on the ground when it comes to some of this challenge? You were talking earlier about coral reefs. What sort of other key challenges or key impacts are we seeing in terms of the action of humans on nature?
Well, Thomas, obviously, most of us, most people, when we mention biodiversity, they think of the most iconic species, polar bears, elephants, tigers, and that's obviously part of it. But we don't connect very often the fact that biodiversity is a much broader set of organisms, for example, that are fundamental to the maintenance of ecological systems, and as I said earlier, our economic systems as well. The fish in the ocean that we depend on for food, for proteins, for jobs, for economy. The role of pollinators in agriculture, 2/3 of the crops are still depending on pollinators. We're talking about pollinators contributing to something like $500 billion in crop production every year. And yet, fish are overfished in the ocean and pollinators are declining sharply. In Europe, we have situations where flying insects, not just bees, but flying insects more in general, they're all pollinators, are 70% decline. So on the ground, the impact is being massive, and we are beginning to see the consequences. The difference between biodiversity and climate change is that climate change, as said earlier, climate change, the impact is much more visible. You can feel it. It's about heat, it's about droughts, it's about floods, it's about extreme weather events. Biodiversity is a more subtle and incremental impact, but when you reach a tipping point, it will be as disastrous as climate change. So it's super important because we know what's happening. We know the impact we are having. We know the consequences they will bring. We need to actually act now, and we need to treat biodiversity collapse as a matter of priority, as we do for climate change, as Anna and others said, because they're also interconnected. So it's not anymore just a moral issue, an emotional issue. Biodiversity conservation used to be something to be said of. When you talk about deforestation, of extinction, you feel bad about it. It's not just about that. It's actually about being concerned about what's happening to the biodiversity of the world, because the impact is going to be not just on the natural world, but also on our own life.
Absolutely, and I think one of the challenges, and now let's start to see what's the reaction and the solutions, is that we have been talking about climate change for a number of years now. I think most people can understand the 1.5 degree threshold challenge we have ahead. Perhaps with nature we're less accustomed. It's less rolling out of our tongues when we're having this conversation, especially in business. And I think that is the challenge. And hopefully we'll touch a little bit more on that on this next session, because it is, as you're saying, Marco, it's more subtle. So then how do we bring it to the mainstream? So, and let's start looking at the responses and whether there are appropriate responses. And we're talking earlier, of course, about the UN Convention on Biological Diversity taking place at the moment, and obviously a lesser known instrument of the UN system. So if you think in general about some of the key stakeholders, whether it's media, investors, youth, business, of course, civil society, what do you think is the key message? Why should they be really concerned about nature when it comes to looking at strategies for future growth and future coexistence, I guess, with nature?
So I think that the main message to tell everyone when it comes to biodiversity is that everyone can play a role and can make a difference at their own level, be it that they are involved as citizens or as city planners, as farmers or as business or as government policymakers. Everyone really can play a role. So of course, COP15 is yesterday. I spoke yesterday at the high-level segment, which is continuing today, and we look a lot at governments, and we should, because governments have a lot at their disposal that can make a difference. They can reform the agricultural policies, the fishery policies, the energy sector. They can conserve, they can create national parks, they can fight illegal trafficking or reward practices that are good for the environment, such as subsidized organic farming, for example. There are many, many things that they can do. But in addition to governments, there are many other actions that are necessary. And just like we've seen businesses and others really step up to the plate and embrace the topic of climate change, we're really now seeing that happening for biodiversity. So we are seeing, of course, young people demonstrate for biodiversity, just like they've been demonstrating for climate. But also in terms of businesses, you may have seen the global risk report of the World Economic Forum that came out just after the IPBES global assessment in 2019. For the first time, it flagged biodiversity loss as one of the 5 top risks to businesses. And I believe that businesses have heard the message, and there is now really a lot of new initiatives in many different types of sectors, looking at sustainable sourcing, for example, looking at life cycle assessment through the lens of biodiversity, and how can, for example, better fibers be found for the fashion industry, organic cotton, for example. So also in terms of the finance sector, we're starting to hear about zero deforestation investment portfolios, for example. So it's really getting concrete in the ground as well. And that is definitely something that needs to be encouraged, and we are at IPBES are looking into tools and methods to enable businesses to better study and measure their impact on biodiversity.
And given that we have you sort of live looking at COP15, and what would you say are what would success look like from a good outcome from this conference?
So, well, what would be important is to have a good set of targets which are quantified. That is important. Then also to have indicators, which means agreed methods to measure progress. Everyone agrees on what needs to be measured when, milestones to reach the targets, and also very importantly, of course, funding, so means for the implementation, and those being put in place immediately. And we need to have also a big emphasis on protection. And Marco talked about 30% protection by 2030. That's hugely ambitious. But in addition to this, and that's what I said yesterday, protection alone is not going to save all of biodiversity. So we really need to put biodiversity at the center of just about every human endeavor, agricultural policy, everything. So we cannot just put nature on the side and then continue business as usual with the rest of the planet. We need a transformative change to change everything else we do and make it biodiversity and climate compatible. That's really the big ambition of COP15.
Absolutely, no, and that's a big shopping list. Targets, methods, funding, and policy and a lot of ambition. So that's a good way of putting it in terms of what's coming ahead. Thanks, Anne. And Hans, can I ask you then? Obviously, Glasgow is nearly upon us, and there's a lot of expectations. So how would you assess, I guess, the way governments have been reacting since Paris, which was such a momentous, joyful period moment, and what has happened since, and we've had a lot of challenges and shockwaves. But are you seeing positive reactions from governments, or are we still a little bit reluctant about what will come out of Glasgow?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. That's a very relevant question, and we are seeing an increase definitely in the responses. There's no question about that. And building on what Anne has said, the challenges are kind of parallel for biodiversity issues and climate issues. And while it seems that biodiversity challenges are catching up, in a way we are also seeing the interdependence between the biodiversity issues and the climate issues. So for both, we can certainly say that in terms of taking action, political will is the bottleneck, and we have seen that especially in our countries in Europe, where we have seen the laggards, we have seen strategies to delay, we have seen strategies to water down any strong action, and that concerns both the biodiversity arena as well as the climate arena. We have still subsidies in the wrong place. If I think about the continuation of subsidies for fossil fuels that are built into our systems, they are certainly very important to be removed. At the same time, I think the 1.5 degree special report of the IPCC has shown in its consequences what is really needed. The young generation has picked up the scientific information, has taken it to heart, has thought about what it means for the future, and especially for their long-term future. And that has caused a societal mobilization, which is very strong. It really indicates that bringing in the scientific information to the policymakers and society is one thing, but by itself it doesn't suffice. We need that kind of societal mobilization, and that is putting pressure on policymakers to take action, remove the inertia, remove the hurdles that are built into the system, and then action can take place. So there is hope for the future, and for both, actually, for biodiversity and for climate. We must say that we need a strengthening of the biosphere, because the biosphere is something in the arena of climate mitigation, is what we depend on in order to stabilize the climate long term. The biosphere should certainly not be taken as an excuse currently, or taken as a dumping site for CO2 emissions, as an excuse to be able to continue CO2 emissions. No, but we need to strengthen it to have it ready then towards mid-century, when it comes to going into net negative emissions, when the biosphere really needs to help us to stabilize the climate towards sustainability. Thanks.
Thanks, Hans. Yes, no, I agree. Definitely, the point around subsidies is something that it's quite damaging, and it's something that we should hope that there would be something more concrete coming in terms of the global ambition of nations, because I'm sure in all of our countries we hear every day politicians talking a lot about commitments and roadmaps and targets, but sometimes 2050 can feel too far away. And holding governments to account is also a challenge for everybody. The other thing that I guess we'll come to it in a few minutes will be around behavioral change and all of us as citizens, and what role is there for governments in terms of incentivizing, rewarding, or penalizing certain behaviors. But Marco, can I ask you, because obviously, as I was saying earlier, WWF has been going on for 60 years, and I remember even as a child looking at some of the advertisements of some of your iconic campaigns, as you were saying earlier. But how do you see the message of NGOs or activists like yourselves that it has evolved over time? Especially, I know it's great that we've mentioned twice now youth, and how do you see the evolution of that message to make this something that we all feel we have to be involved?
Well, Thomas, first of all, I've been passionate about nature since I was a kid. I became a member of WWF since I was 12. So I've seen the narrative evolve quite a bit over the decade. And the main change is that today we're not discussing nature conservation and human survival and development and well-being separately. The two agendas are converging. That's the most significant development, in my view, of the narrative. Today, we're beginning finally to understand actually we depend on nature more than nature depends on us. And when we say we're going to save the planet, frankly, it's a very arrogant statement. We are going to save ourselves because if we don't maintain and preserve the planet, we will be in trouble first. And let me just say one other thing, because when we talk about the problems that we are creating to the world and to ourselves, there is a risk that we slide into pessimism, cynicism, doom and gloom. Let me just be very clear. We can fix this. We have the resources, intellectual, technological, to fix this. We just need to focus now on the transition from where we are, that we know is not a good place and is going to drive us to big problems, to where we want to be, which we know is going to be a safer place. Transition, this is where we need to focus, and that's why we need to start redirecting financial investment, put regulation in place, and change our lifestyle. And this is where the power of consumers is incredibly important. So please don't think for a second that all is lost. We can fix it. We need to move fast at scale and all together, government, businesses, and consumers in our own lives, as well in the choices that we make when we vote and when we buy food in the supermarket.
Absolutely. I think one of the expressions that have been created recently is that of eco-anxiety. And I can definitely relate. I'm currently living in Ireland, and there's a lot of conversation about how youth feel totally out of hope. And maybe there is a challenge there about how we are communicating or not communicating properly. And I think your message, Marco, in that sense, it's very important, because that's the message we need to give everybody, without a doubt. Okay, so let's move then a little bit into the solutions mode, because that's something that I think will add to the sense of hope that we're trying to communicate this morning. So Marco, I'll start with you then, and can you tell us a little bit about how we integrate nature preservation into business strategy and into business decision making? I think we've already touched on some points, and you were talking about food, energy, and finance, and also mentioned some of these issues. But what would you say are the critical factors there to be looking at for any business that probably feels, I don't know what to do or where to start?
Well, as you said earlier, the double challenge of climate and biodiversity loss is very clear, and the drivers of that loss are very clear as well, clearly, and the type of energy that we consume and the way we consume it is the main driver of emissions, because today we are still burning too much fossil fuel. And so, as I said, on climate, I think the direction is very clear. We have to halve emissions by 2030 and become carbon neutral by 2050. That's a pathway which is super clear, is measurable, and today we're actually able to develop, based on that global goal for climate, we can develop a science-based targets per sector and per company. We are founders, together with other organizations, of a science-based target for climate initiative. We have now 1,500 businesses adopting these targets. and adopting effectively a plan to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. The same needs to happen for nature. And nature is a little bit more complex because the drivers are multiple, from food production, both on land and in the sea, to, of course, the impact that infrastructure is having. Exploitation of forests is another big one, extractives. So each sector will have to take different approaches, but fundamentally, the fundamental approach that we need to take is to develop infrastructure, develop agriculture, catch fish in the ocean, extract minerals from the soil in a way that does not affect the level of biodiversity in those areas. And this is possible by adopting sustainable practices. And sustainable practices incentivized by public subsidies and by private investment. Agriculture is a typical example. Today we are using far too much pesticides and fertilizers, but there is an emerging organic farming movement which is actually taking roots and is developing fast. Imagine if the $400 billion, more or less, dollars of incentives for the current business as usual agriculture would be redirected towards regenerative, organic, nature-friendly, nature-positive agriculture. Then the transition will happen faster. At the end of the day, my last point is about financial flows. If you direct the financial flows towards the right transition, we're going to get where we want to be at the right time and fast enough.
Absolutely. It is, I guess, at the end of the day about testing and trying solutions and then putting them on the mainstream in terms of its implementation. The other point, I think, Marco, that it's quite critical is that around disclosure and transparency. I think when it comes to business, and I think it's great how with climate there have been some very strong initiatives in the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, and I think we're all very hopeful that something similar will happen with nature. It would be very interesting to see how that gets even more implemented and mainstreamed.
It's happening, and there was just last month the announcement of the task force of nature risk-related disclosure, which basically is about companies, financial institutions disclosing their impact on nature so that they, on one hand, are compelled to put in place plans to reduce that impact, but also are making transparent to consumers and investors their risk portfolio vis-a-vis nature, not just climate. And there is a new initiative called Finance for Nature that brings together about, I think now about 80 finance institutions, total about $19 trillion in assets, that are committed to assess their footprint in terms of investment about nature loss and de-risk their portfolio gradually by divesting and reinvesting in nature-positive transitions. They're using exactly this word, nature-positive investments. And so, it is happening. And just to say, it's not a question of finding a lot of new money. There is new money needed, it's true, particularly for protected areas in developing countries where there is a shortage of resources. But when it comes to actual economic sectors, the majority of the funding needed is about redirecting money already spent on those sectors, but to be spent in a better way, in a nature-friendly, nature-positive, climate-neutral way.
Absolutely. Thanks, Marco. Hans, can I ask you to help us better understand? Marco was talking about science-based targets. Can you give us a sense of how do they work and how can they support a business in this journey to net zero?
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. Certainly the science-based targets in the climate world are a little bit easier to define than in the biodiversity world, as Marco has already emphasized. For the climate world, very, very clearly, we must see that life on this planet is specialized on limited temperature ranges, especially when we talk about climate. Temperature is a key driver survival and performance of all life forms, and that includes our own species. And our own species may well illustrate the relationship between sort of climate targets and biodiversity targets because our species has colonized the planet during the last 8 to 10,000 years, while we have been enjoying a climate that has allowed us to do so at all latitudes. And with the current warming and the current temperature moving out of that pleasant sort of climate window that we've had, moving out of the temperature range of the Holocene, we are seeing that we are starting to lose human habitat, especially at the low latitudes, in those areas where temperature-humidity combinations are becoming unpleasant for human life, at least for staying and working outside. And this is a challenge that we can sort of transfer to many life forms. We see a depression of productivity of plants with respect to their capacity to bind CO2 during heat waves and during the respective summer months at the low latitudes. Earth's history is telling us that there have been phases when actually the lowest latitudes were virtually void of higher complex lives, meaning animals and complex plants. This concerns the Permian-Triassic mass extinction event, which is kind of, in terms of its temperature conditions, at the high end of what climate scenarios are currently telling us of where we are. So there are clear warnings at the wall that we can consider, and these are science-based warnings, and we need evidence-based policies in place to avoid that. And the 1.5 degree temperature target, based on seeing the incremental development of impacts and risks really correlated with the degree of warming, is a compromise already. It's not going to be a better world than today if we go to 1.5. No, I mean 1.5 seems still to be a realistic target that we can reach with high ambition emissions reduction as a precondition, and that is a key precondition also for being able to maintain biodiversity. So we can and not maintain, but only maintain, but also restore biodiversity. So the strengthening of the biosphere that I've been talking about really involves a limitation and a mitigation of climate change based on ambitious emissions reduction. And then with the strengthened biosphere building on such climate stabilization, we will be able to also solve the biodiversity crisis. This is, I think, clearly emphasizes the interdependence between the two sectors. Thanks.
Thanks, Hans. And on the point around the science-based targets, I think the critical thing that you're saying is how any sort of set of targets that a business or a sector or a country will set will have to be based on the scientific evidence that it's behind it, as opposed to just a target that's set with no foundation, and I hopefully we can come back to that, because I think that's something critical for business to think about. The Marco was talking about the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and they did a report just a few weeks ago, and they have found out that a significant number of companies had made pledges and stated their ambitions in preparation of Glasgow, but that they were not based on science. So that's a key message. And can I ask you then about nature-based solutions, which again I think it's a very overarching expression, but it's definitely one that we want everybody in the forum today to take with them. So how would you describe nature-based solutions, and how can a company get started?
Yeah, so nature-based solutions are exactly what Hans was just referring to. It's about strengthening the biosphere. So it's a series of measures to rebuild or to conserve nature in order to address other major environmental challenges. And in doing so, you not only address this other environmental challenge, such as climate change, but you also preserve your biodiversity. So examples include, for example, restoring mangrove ecosystems in order to control erosions on the coastlines. By doing so, you preserve biodiversity, you provide lots of other services as well, and you control erosion. Or bringing biodiversity, bringing nature more into cities. Marco has made a mention of that as well. And that allows you to not only reconnect a little bit people to nature, which is very important in order to trigger their involvement, but also it will allow the cities to be cooled and therefore to do a little bit better to attenuate the impact of climate change. Importantly, nature-based solutions are discussed a lot in the context of conserving and restoring forests in order to mitigate against climate change. We know that forests are absorbing a third of our annual greenhouse gas emissions. They could certainly do more, and it's a way to invest in nature, in biodiversity, with all of the other contributions that people derive from nature, in addition to attenuating against climate change. So there is a lot that can be done. Those are just some of the examples. And the 30% of species protection or protected areas by 2030, both in land and in the oceans, can go a long way towards nature-based solution. Again, as long as proper means of implementation, including funding, are redirected toward really making protection a reality on the ground, which is, as we know, often not the case, particularly in developing countries.
And in terms of companies looking to get more embedded in this, and obviously for climate we have the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Is there sort of an equivalent resource or initiative to direct companies to, or is there more than one that worth mentioning?
So not yet, but there is, as I said before, a lot of initiatives and thinking right now from companies. And as I was mentioning, at IPBES, we are working with companies. In fact, we are going to soon call for experts from business and industry to help IPBES produce a report which is going to look at the impact and dependencies on businesses on biodiversity. And it's also particularly going to focus on the different types of indicators, of methods to measure and to monitor this impact. Because right now there is just a few methods that are popping up here and there. Yeah. They need to be scientifically assessed in order to be able to also have common measures so that we can compare.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, thanks for the heads up on that. We'll be very much looking forward to see how that's evolving and how your own organization is progressing on that space. So that's very, very, very useful. And thanks, Marco. Again, let's go back to youth because they're the ones that are very, very anxious and concerned. Any thoughts of how we can start even at that level, at the level of young people and education, making a difference in how we are communicating this extremely complex set of challenges ahead of us?
Yeah, well, the good news is that I think we already see youth mobilizing quite a lot. And so today, as I said very early in my presentation, one of the new dimensions is that today the facts are quite well known, and so the consequences as well, better known than ever before. The evidence of the impact, the evidence of the crisis, the evidence of the risks has never been greater. And that's a major starting point, which is exactly what the youth is reacting to. By understanding the challenge, by understanding the issues, we're seeing a lot of youth concerns and mobilization like we've never seen before. And there is a risk still, as I said earlier, of sliding some sectors of the youth population slide into pessimism, and there was a recent study, I think, launched by the BBC in the UK that called for this eco-anxiety. So an anxiety in young, very young population, youth population, very strong anxiety about the future, something that previous generations never experienced. And the reason is because today we understand better what is at stake and the challenges that we are facing. But on the other hand, we commissioned with the Economist Intelligence Unit a survey around the world, looking at the sentiments of young people and people in general to nature. And there is clearly a much grown awareness and a much greater readiness to actually adapt, change, adopt new lifestyles which are more nature friendly. And so overall, the picture, it seems to me, positive. There is greater awareness, there is greater mobilization. And if I can send a message to the young audience that perhaps are listening today, you are absolutely right. And so be angry for what's happening. Be angry for the system that is not changing fast enough, but also don't lose enthusiasm. Be excited about the opportunity for change, because this is the decade where we can actually correct our course, destructive, wasteful way of developing that we've been using for the last 20, 60 years, and something sustainable and more equitable as we move forward in the future.
Absolutely, thanks. That's really powerful, and we're just in the final minutes of the session. So we started the forum talking about action, and this has to be about action. So I'll ask my final question to all of you actually, and I'll start with you, Hans. What is your call to action? Looking at what we have been discussing so far and the challenges ahead, and thinking particularly about the business community that is following the forum.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. That's a large call. I think adding to what Marco just said, I would like to emphasize that understanding the life-sustaining functioning of our planet is a prime precondition for any proper action, and it's not just about educating the youth. This kind of education is there for all of us, and that includes policymakers, many of whom are lawyers or political scientists who don't have this basis in the natural sciences that they would need to develop this deeper understanding, so that they are not always that they can act out of their own motivation and are not moving towards the false compromises. So in that respect, and this certainly also concerns the business world, but in many cases in the business world, I sometimes have the impression that they are already farther ahead than policymakers are, and they should join the societal mobilization and pushing policy towards making the right decisions. The first emphasis is ambitious emissions reduction, keeping to the climate target, removing subsidies from fossil fuels, and developing lifestyles and enabling lifestyles, and the emphasis is on enabling lifestyles that are meeting the requirements of sustainability in terms of low emissions, the circular economy, and and low technology approaches to the same problems that will give all of us the time then to develop our society further towards that sustainability. All sectors of society are involved, and this we need to think biodiversity and climate in parallel, consider their interdependencies in terms of the actions to be taken, and certainly we also need to consider that moving towards solving one of the crises shouldn't come with measures that are maladaptive for the other crisis, and so this should be the guiding principles, and every small step counts. So and not wasting time anymore, I think, is the major and the biggest call. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, thanks, Hans. Anne, anything to add to that, to your call for action?
So I would say that people should think about their actions, everything they do, through the lens of biodiversity. Think about the consequences of everything they do on the environment, on nature. So question their consumption habit. Ask questions about the origin of their food. Does the meat they are eating today drives deforestation at the other end of the world, in the Amazon forest, for example? We really need to increase our awareness about how we are tightly coupled and how we depend on our environment. So people should really now deeply think about how they themselves, and that includes businesses, how they impact on their environment. I also believe, I agree with what Hans and Marco have said. I think that businesses, many citizens are ahead of their governments on that issue. And so citizens are also in democracies, people who vote, and they should really demand more action from their government and hold their governments accountable more in an increasing and more intense manner. So that would be my call for action. Thank you.
Fantastic, Anne. Thank you very much. So really think of consequences. Marco, final word. Anything to add from your call to action?
Well, Anne and Hans has mentioned a very powerful call of action. My only additional call for action is specifically to the world leaders that are meeting today and in the next few days in Kunming around the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is the opportunity to create a Paris-style agreement for nature with a clear direction, a clear global goal that will force to disrupt economic systems that had to change as the climate goal has done for the energy sector. And so my plea is to the world leaders to listen to the consumers and to the companies that already are embracing a carbon neutral and a nature positive pathway, codify that pathway into a global plan that brings us all together, because that's what we need to do. We need to pull to this a global challenge. We need everybody, but governments play a key role in codifying that direction and sending a signal to the markets that this is the future that we want. 90 head of states have already signed the Leaders' Pledge for Nature last September at the UNGA, at the UN General Assembly, committing to reverse nature loss by 2030. It's time now for the whole world to embrace that goal, and together with the one on climate, translate it into a proper transition plan. And it's possible, it's necessary, and it's something that we owe to the next generation.
Absolutely, without a doubt, and I have to say it's been an amazing journey of discussing these issues with yourselves this morning. I'm taking a lot of messages, but clearly some that are very important or that I found very relevant around. We have the evidence, so it's all about the science. Not waste time, ambition, targets. And a big message around lifestyles, but also around some of the big initiatives that will help business in this journey. So we have 1 minute left, and this is a very IMS Luxembourg tradition. We're going to finally close this session with a fast and furious, and we have been rehearsing, haven't we, in terms of preparing for this part of the session. So everybody knows what this is about. So one question, two options, one response. Anne, I'm going to start with you. Your first fast and furious: restore or preserve?
Oh, so I would say preserve first, and if it's been degraded, then restore, but preserve first for sure.
Well done. Hans, high tech or low tech?
Low tech if possible, but high tech is needed to complement the effort.
Excellent. And Marco, nature-based solutions or science-based targets?
I'm afraid both, because one is about strengthening nature response, and the other one is about cutting our own footprint.
Super. Okay, well, listen, we've come to an end. Can I please say thank you very much to Marco, Anne, and Hans for taking the time. Technology has been on our side, so we have survived this session without any blips. So well done, everybody. And we're going to now take a break, and we'll be back in around 11. So thank you very much, and looking forward to the rest of the forum. And thanks again to all the speakers. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.